that's a little bit of what we found in water quality. Why are we even talking about water quality? We're talking about weed management. What does that have to do with water quality? Well, because the vegetation in the system has a big part to do with water quality. And so this is a cartoon that I developed, but it's based on actual science. And that is, sediment content can give rise to an algal bloom by being transported into the water through vegetation. It sounds like a strange concept, but the Army Corps has been looking into this for 40 years. And the Army Corps looks into this because they manage reservoirs. And aquatic vegetation, particularly nuisance vegetation, getting into a reservoir has been associated with degraded water quality because plants like this, which like curly-leaf pondweed and Eurasian water milfoil, get their nutrients mostly from the sediments. So they get their nitrogen, they get their phosphorus from the sediments, goes up into the tissue, and as the tissue, as the biomass increases over the course of the year, that's where the nitrogen and phosphorus came from. They're not getting their nutrients from the water column, they're getting it from the sediments. And when they die, those nutrients can be transported into the water column. It doesn't happen immediately, and it's not 100%, but it's not 0%. The data we've got suggests that 50 to 70% of the nitrogen and phosphorus that's in this biomass of the weeds makes it into the water column during decomposition. And if they got it out of the sediments, and it's half of that is now in the water column, that's a mechanism to adversely impact water quality through this vegetation. So that's not a new concept. It's been around for decades, and that's what we think is one of the important things we have to look at. The other part of it is, it doesn't take a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus to get you a lot of vegetation. So we know from data that's been collected in the Tahoe Keys that the average phosphorus content for Eurasian water milfoil is 0.28% phosphorus dry weight. And if you do the math on that, 90% of these plants is water. And then the second most common thing is carbon. Well, they're making carbon out of the carbon in the water, which is out of the atmosphere. So carbon's not limiting, water's not limiting. What's limiting is nutrients. So if you're limited by phosphorus and you only have to have 0.28% to grow, that means a pound of phosphorus can get you literally 1.5 tons of these weeds. So if you see 1.5 tons of these weeds, it only takes a pound of phosphorus to get you that. And it doesn't take a lot of phosphorus-enriched sediments to get you a lot of vegetation. And you kind of would know this because this isn't the only place where these weeds grow. They grow in places that have kind of much cleaner sediments. So this vegetation isn't limited to just here. It might be more abundant here for a couple of reasons, but it's not limited to just here. You have it in other locations. So it doesn't take a lot of phosphorus to get you a lot of this vegetation. And this vegetation is a pathway to get nutrients from the sediments up into the water column. So what we have is this conceptual ecosystem model because we're trying to take all this data and develop kind of management guidance. How do we address the issue of the vegetation without making an algal bloom? That's kind of like what I'm trying to give kind of a bookend guidance on. So the current conditions is rooted vegetation accesses sediments for the nutrients. Doesn't take a lot to get you a lot of biomass. 1 pound, 1.5 tons, 3,500 pounds to be exact. And this is a mechanism for a pathway of nutrients getting up to the water column. Now here's your best possible scenario with aquatic weed management is you get rid of the vegetation and the bad vegetation, the stuff that's not native, and you shut down that kind of nutrient transport, and only good things happen because you've gotten rid of that pathway. That's your best possible outcome. Your worst possible outcome is you do this too aggressively and you actually get a pulse of nutrients into the water column quickly, and that pulse of nutrients gives rise to something else that you don't want, and that could be a nuisance algal bloom, and that's the kind of worst case scenario. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to figure out what's more likely and how do you put a bookend on the kind of activities so that you don't create the second scenario while you're trying to get the first one. So the first thing we have to figure out is what nutrients are we concerned about, and where are they, and where did they come from? And if you know all that, then you can come up with management guidance that's going to help you figure out what to do properly so that you don't end up with something that you don't want to have. So the first thing we're going to do is do a nutrient pool analysis. So we're going to figure out where the nutrients are, nitrogen and phosphorus, and it's easy to do that for the water column. So if you've got 100 acres and it's 10 feet deep, then you have 1,000 acre feet. Acre feet gets turned into volume. We can turn that to liters, right? And then we take the phosphorus concentration and we multiply that by the volume. Now I've got a mass of phosphorus or nitrogen, right? So it's easy to do for the water. For the vegetation, it's harder to do because we have good data on how common this stuff is, and we have good data on the biovolume, which is what percentage of the water, but we don't have good data yet, although it's being hopefully going to be collected, about the biomass. And so the biggest data gap I have here is biomass. How much weed biomass do we have? Grams dry weight per meter square. I'm using values from the literature. It could be high, it could be low, but we've also done a sensitivity analysis. And if we're off by 50%, it doesn't matter a lot, because remember when I said 28 parts per billion? Let's just use that for a phosphorus concentration. So 28 parts per billion would be an elevated phosphorus concentration in the water. The phosphorus content of this tissue is 0.28%. So 0.28% is 2.8 parts per thousand, or 28 parts per 10,000. So the phosphorus content of the plant tissue is 28 parts per 10,000. In the water, it's 28 parts per billion. Plants concentrate these nutrients. So it doesn't take a lot of vegetation to have a lot more nutrient content than what's floating around in the water column. And that's the reason why this shows you that the vast majority of the nutrients are in the vegetation. And what that means is, be careful what you do to that vegetation. If you were to kill all this vegetation right away in one day, and 100% of it went into the water column, you'd have a dramatic increase. You'd have a 10-fold increase in your nutrient content. That doesn't happen. But the point we're trying to get across is, be careful what you do to the vegetation, because that's where most of the nitrogen and phosphorus is, okay? Same thing in the main lagoon. Lake Tahoe, it's a little bit different. Lake Tahoe, there's a little bit higher nutrient content, remember? So the biomass is still the majority, but it's not as overwhelming. It's not 90% anymore, but it's still like, 2/3 of it, right? Yeah, 2/3 roughly. So here's the kind of scenario. You've got this luxuriant vegetation, and you're too aggressive in killing it off by whatever mechanism. And it doesn't mean herbicide alone. Any mechanism that leaves the material behind to decay leaves the nutrients behind to decay. So this could be happening with LFA. It could be happening with UV treatment. Anything that leaves the biomass behind in the lagoon leaves the nutrients behind in the lagoon. They don't just magically disappear. They have to go somewhere. And so what this means is, if you do that, then there's a possibility of the nutrient remineralization to give rise to a phytoplankton bloom. So this sounds like theory, right? But it's not theory. It actually happens. This is a report done in China. It's a Chinese lake. It's not Sierra Nevada. It's not the cold water that you have here, but it's the same species. This is curly-leaf pondweed. And curly-leaf pondweed in this Chinese lake has a summer temperature-induced die-off. And when that happens, the nutrient content that used to be in all the vegetation becomes available to the water column, and you get a cyanobacteria bloom. Nobody wants to have this. So the key here is that you can have a scenario where you transfer nutrients from vegetation to the water column. This is temperature. This isn't someone going out there and managing this vegetation. But this is a system that I've worked on where people have managed our nuisance vegetation. This is a place called Lake Tarpon in Florida. Again, it's not Lake Tahoe. But what we found in this system is, in this case, it's chemical treatment, and the amount of acreage that's treated is positively correlated with chlorophyll, which means the more I treat, the greener the water gets. So that is a kind of human-induced version of this scenario that we see right here. So there is reason to be concerned about how you manage the eradication of this vegetation. So the first thing we want to do to try to bookend, kind of guidance about what to do is we need to figure out what's the nutrient of concern. Is it phosphorus? Is it nitrogen? It might be different for the plants than the algae in the water column. So the plants look like maybe they're limited by phosphorus, but that doesn't mean the stuff growing in the water is. So we're going to try to figure that out first. And then we're going to figure out, where did that come from in the beginning? Where did the nitrogen or phosphorus come from? And that can help us understand how important actions are in different types of things. Is it stormwater? Is it groundwater? Is it the vegetation? That's what we're going to try to figure out. So we collect all this data and we plot it, and there's nothing really that complicated about this analysis. It's just an empirically derived relationship. This is the relationship between chlorophyll, which is how much algae is in the water, versus nitrogen. And if you see a line, that means it's a statistically significant correlation, which means more nitrogen, more algae. And the cool thing is, this can allow us to make some predictions. So if I do something to make the nitrogen go from here to there, I can predict that the chlorophyll will go from here to there. So an empirical relationship allows us to make predictions about how the water quality will respond if I can change the nitrogen and phosphorus concentration. There's nothing for phosphorus, so the vegetation might be limited by phosphorus, but the algae in the water column doesn't look like it is. In the main lagoon, nitrogen and phosphorus are both correlated, so it's important to manage nitrogen and phosphorus. But this number right here, it's called the R-square value. It's 0.66, this one's 0.23. They're both statistically significant, but the way to interpret this is 66% of the variability in chlorophyll is explained by variability in nitrogen, only about 23 of phosphorus, so it means both are important, nitrogen's more important. So management of nitrogen is important for the main lagoon. Now the cool thing, to me, maybe to you, is in TLAC there's no relationship at all. So this means that TLAC is not as sensitive to nutrients as the other two systems. So what's the biggest difference between TLAC and the other two systems is when you're in a boat and you're in the main lagoon and you go to the land, you hit a seawall, right, for the most part. When you're in TLAC and you go to land, you hit a shoreline, a natural shoreline. And it might be a wetland, it might be an extensive wetland. Wetlands and natural shorelines give water bodies a certain level of resilience against nutrients. So a natural shoreline can give a system resilience against nutrients. It's not just nutrients. It's nutrients and what that water body is connected to, which means, it doesn't mean don't pay attention to nutrients. It means pay attention to the natural shoreline in TLAC and maybe see if you can bring that influence to some degree back to the main lagoon and the marine lagoons. Some of the things you could do to improve water quality would be, I don't know, try to recreate a little bit of that wetland influence for a place that doesn't have a wetland influence at all right now. And so that's a really cool finding, because that suggests that TLAC is telling you how to make the system less sensitive to getting an algal bloom is having that kind of shoreline feature. So, summarizing it all, nitrogen for the marine lagoon, the main lagoon, nitrogen and phosphorus, Lake TLAC. So we're going to do a nutrient loading model that's going to do nitrogen and phosphorus, because both of them look like they're important to some degree. So, last part. You guys got it so far? All right, so it's all building. This is the exciting part. So what we have to do, we have to figure out the nutrient loads. See, he's excited. And we're going to look at external loads. We're going to look at stormwater, and we're going to look at groundwater. So Jim talked about how we are measuring piezometers. Piezometers measure the water level. So, you know, you've got topography that we don't have in Florida, which is like the land rises really sharply. And that means that the groundwater will flow to the north, right? And as it flows to the north, that could be a more important source of water than stormwater runoff. The nutrient content that flows to the north carries with it nitrogen and phosphorus. So we have numbers on the water budget, we have numbers on nitrogen and phosphorus. So we can figure out the groundwater nitrogen budget for Lake TLAC and the main lagoon and the marina lagoon. We also have an estimate of stormwater loads that we based on the TMDL for this system that was developed a couple of years ago. So it might not have rained, but we're using the runoff coefficients and rainfall on average for this region, and we're multiplying it by a stormwater nutrient concentration that was collected in sort of a first flush environment. And we're going to compare that to lake rise. When the water comes up in the lake, it flows into the lagoon. It brings with it nitrogen and phosphorus. So we're going to figure out that part of the budget. And then atmospheric deposition. That's an important part of the TMDL for the lake itself. We can take those numbers and apply them to the lagoon and TLAC as well. And then we have internal loads, nutrient fluxes. There's nitrogen, there's phosphorus in the sediments. How important are they as a source of nutrients into the water column? And then the last thing is the vegetation decomposition. Right now, you have a pathway for getting nutrients up into the water column through the sediments. And we're going to try to put that in perspective as well. So we're going to do this for nitrogen and phosphorus. We're going to do it, I'm going to show you results for the main lagoon and Lake TLAC only. So this is what it comes up to. So The green stands for the, SAV stands for submerged aquatic vegetation. So the green stands for the weed decomposition. So this is nutrients from the sediment that go into the biomass that then becomes available into the water column. We have good data on phosphorus release of decomposing Eurasian water milfoil from a master's thesis that was done right here in the Tahoe Keys Lagoon. And what she found was about 50% of the phosphorus becomes available to the water column within about 20 days. The total release is over 70 days, but the vast majority of that is happening in 20 days. We don't have data for nitrogen, but we have it from the literature, which says about the same thing, about 50, 60%. So it's not like all the nitrogen, all the phosphorus comes into the water column, but maybe 50, 60% of it over the course of 20 days. So all that biomass that was in the vegetation that originally came from the sediments, about half of it can become available to the water column. That is a major source of the water nutrient budget, is the vegetation that got it from the sediments. So there's that pathway, if you would, of sediment, plant, water column. Other things are important. Stormwater irrigation, groundwater inflow, lake rise, atmospheric deposition. The sediments flux wasn't important in the main lagoon or in Tallac because the phosphorus content wasn't that high. So we compared phosphorus content in these sediments to the phosphorus content from 50 lakes in Sierra Nevada, and it's really not that high. It's not like the bottom of Harbor and Lake Erie. It's just not really that high. And the phosphorus content, remember, it doesn't take a lot of phosphorus to get you a lot of weed biomass. And you know that because these weeds aren't restricted to just here. They're found in lots of places with kind of clean looking sediments. So it doesn't take you a lot to get you a lot of biomass. And we don't have a lot of phosphorus in the sediments. We don't have a lot of phosphorus, and therefore they don't appear to be a really substantial source of phosphorus into the water column, even though we have some places where there's not a lot of oxygen. So they could be locally important, but system-wide they didn't come up to be that important. Tallac, you can see that the weed decomposition is a smaller percentage because these guys are more important. Stormwater irrigation and groundwater inflow, because the watershed is so much bigger for Tallac. The watershed for Tallac is basically kind of, I'll get the roads wrong, Lake Tahoe Road and damn it, and Emerald Bay Road, right? So everything kind of like north of them is rough approximation of the watershed for Lake Tallac. Now, what's the watershed for the main lagoon? It's basically just the areas between the open waters. The watershed for Lake Lagoon is small compared to the watershed for Tallac because it's just that area that is south of, Tallac goes to Tallac. So they're the ones that experience. Tallac is the one that experiences the large groundwater load for the same reason. It intercepts that groundwater load, and then a certain amount of Tallac's inflowing groundwater then flows to the main lagoon. And we actually had our hydrologist develop a water budget. We multiplied that water budget by the nitrogen and phosphorus content to figure out a groundwater inflow. So Tallac has a higher nitrogen and phosphorus, a higher nitrogen from stormwater irrigation and groundwater because it's got a larger watershed, and it's the first place that intercepts that groundwater inflow. So we find the same thing for phosphorus, roughly. The phosphorus from stormwater irrigation to Lake Tallac is larger than it is from decomposition because the phosphorus concentration used in the stormwater runoff was a higher value. So that could be that it had pollen in it, it could be that it had something else in it, but it was the number we had, and that's what we plugged into the water budget for that system. So pulling all this together, the decomposition of vegetation accounts for like 60 to 70% or more of the phosphorus loads in the main lagoon and nitrogen. So it's 4 times as important as anything else. So for the main lagoon, it looks like the biggest issue you have in terms of water quality is the cycling from the sediments to the plant to the decomposing to the water column through decomposition. In Tallac, decomposition is still, like 40% or so. That's kind of important, but it's secondary to groundwater and stormwater inflow for Tallac because it's got a larger watershed and it is the first place to intercept the groundwater inflow. So more important is the implications. Most of the nitrogen and phosphorus in these systems is in the vegetation. What you do to that vegetation matters. And if you look at it as a source of nutrients to the water column, that's important. But if you're too aggressive in treating it and you get too much of it too quickly into the water column, you could end up with an adverse impact. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to help bookend what kind of activities can take place. It's not just about herbicides. It's herbicides, UV, LFA, anything that leaves the biomass in the lake to decompose, if done too quickly, too overzealous, could be a source of nutrients that could perhaps give you an unanticipated, unwanted side effect. So we're trying to give a guidance, and because we've got these nutrient chlorophyll relationships, we can develop guidance about what would be the impact of, say, an increase in nitrogen content from 0.18 to 0.28, something like that. We can go to that because we have this information from the system. So in TLAC, you've got kind of a different scenario because you actually seem to be more nutrient insensitive, and that's a good thing. That doesn't mean don't pay attention to nutrients. It means the opposite. Pay attention to the thing that gave you that kind of nutrient insensitivity and maintain it. And you might want to actually even try to see if you can export some of that phenomena to the other systems to make them less sensitive to nitrogen and phosphorus loads if you can, if something can be done on that. So summary theme, all the things together, the water quality, you exceed the criteria for the open waters of the lake. No apparent trends, but it does look like you might have had a cyanobacteria bloom in the past. And so I kind of suggest you might have them in the future. The concern about nutrient management is not that it's a bad idea. It's, if done incorrectly or overzealously, could give you an unanticipated consequence that you really don't want to be at. But they are, it appears right now, a source of nutrients coming into the water column. That's not a novel phenomenon. The Army Corps has documented this for decades now. That's why they're concerned, is because it adversely affects water quality in reservoirs. Looks like you've got the same scenario going on here as well. And so, can you quantify this to give some kind of bookend guidance? I think you can, because you've got good relationships in some places, and also I think we can actually kind of give some guidance about trying to get TLAC type of features in more areas to make more areas less sensitive to nutrients. I think would be a good idea. And with that, if there's time for any questions.